Now, local councils will no longer be forced to set aside greenfield land to meet their future housing needs under a new planning system to be announced by ministers. According to the Centre of Cities, the UK has a backlog of 4.3 million homes. And maybe we are a bit too sentimental about greenbelt land. Are we a nation of NIMBYs? Jacqueline, let me come to you. 2019, the Conservatives promised that they would build 300,000 houses a year. I think, actually, they've not done too badly, I have to say. I mean, in 22 to 23, they built 234,000 houses, which is not that shy of their 300,000. But now, apparently, the councils are being told, you're not going to have to push these houses through. You can leave it up to you make the decisions for yourself. We're not going to hold you to these targets. The cynic in me says that this is because they're hoping that there won't be the local controversies which might stop Conservative MPs winning seats in the next election.
Well, genuinely, I don't think it's just about Conservative members of Parliament at all. It is a NIMBY situation because councillors are elected, whatever party, and you know, they'll have constituents who'll come and see them and they'll say, you know, we need more housing, we need, you know, we've got families and this village and this town's grown. And then, of course, the councils turn around and go, OK, then we've now got a proposition to build 3,000 houses, whatever, and the same people who've been lobbying actually will turn around and say, oh, no, you can't build them here. And I think it's sometimes just a bit between a rock and a hard place. We don't have the same laws in place, the sort of Napoleonic laws that they have in France, where they just basically say, well, we're going to build 3,000 houses, they're so tough, or we're going to put a, you know, high-speed railway line through, so that's tough too. So on the positive side, of course, we need to discuss these things, but there's an awful lot also of brownfield sites where they could be cleaned up, they could be actually available for building. But we do need actually the councils to take, I think, they can't keep fobbing off saying, well, it's you know, it's central government, it's central government. Central government can only do so much, but when you get into the whole legal challenges that go on, they're often down at local level. OK, the Secretary of State may have to make a final decision, but it's those on the ground. And I think they've just got to be pretty tough with the public to say, look, we need more housing. And that's the end of it.
What's your position on this, Peter? Because we do need more housing, and it does feel like every time there is a proposal to build a big new housing estate in a lovely area outside of our major cities, suddenly it gets pulled at the last minute because the locals don't want it.
Sometimes that's the case, but we're in a situation where Labour say we should build more houses, the Tories, who are the government, say we should build more houses, all of us, all of you, say we should build more houses, and then so do charities like Shelter as well. This is a charter for not building houses, so that will create a further problem in terms of supply. Others dispute it. I absolutely think supply and demand affects the price, and I think it's daft to deny that. Where I live in London, the average price of a starter home is above 400k. A starter home, well, that used to be someone aged 25. Now people like to get their starter home and think they'd be lucky to get one before the age of 40. Imagine if you're a single person trying to buy your first home for over 400k. This is a charter for not building houses. Of course, it's down to electoral politics, NIMBYism to a certain extent, although that glosses over a range of issues, and sticky moments with one or two Conservative backbenchers. Of course, this is being said now because we're 12 months or fewer off a general election.
And so, go on, elaborate on that a little bit more. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think it's this issue that, as you and Jacqueline alluded to, that you can have local development can be very unpopular, and Michael Gove, who is a housing secretary, has at times objected to housing developments within his constituency. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, but because MPs have a local role, and I think that's a good thing, that MPs have an eye on what's going on in their patch, whether they're red, blue, yellow or SNP. But the point is, we're not building enough houses. That's consistently been the case under Conservatives. There are particular issues around backbenchers in a trade-off between holding their seat and building housing developments. And then presiding over all of this is we reshuffle the housing minister on average once every year. So in 13 years of government, we've had, I can't remember, it's about 13 or 14 housing ministers over 13 years.
Crazy. So how do they get a handle on such a difficult issue when they're only in the job for 5 minutes? There's also, of course, I just wonder, Jacqueline, whether there's enough creativity to this issue as well. We've now got so many offices sitting empty around our cities. Do you think the will is there, whether that is private or public will to get those properties working for people to live in them?
I think there's a couple of issues. First of all, the elephant in the room is we have probably had 2 or 3 million people come to this country in the last 3 or 4 years. And it's a complete oxymoron. On the one hand, everybody's going, but there's not enough accommodation for anybody that's already here. And at the same time, the left or the Labour Party go, well, no, we don't want the Rwanda scheme and we don't want this scheme and we don't want to try and tighten up illegal immigration, etc., etc. And then you're sort of sitting there and saying, well, what do you want? Because you need to start looking at the reality. If there isn't enough housing for people who are already in this country, that we're trying to obviously deal with all the restrictions that go with that. How can you then have this open door policy, which is what the left's policy is? So even more and more people come in. But if it can just come to this point, it's not just about house buying, because a lot of people, when I was young, we couldn't buy something initially. We were a bit older and then you're having to save up. I think there are a couple of things. The local authorities do have a responsibility if you're looking at, and housing associations. So we need more social housing stock. So there needs to be more of that, apart from, obviously, the private developers, because as Peter quite rightly says, if you want to be around London or Greater London area, the costs are huge. But, you know, in the north and in other parts of the country, there are quite reasonable places that you can buy. And it behoves building societies and banks, who are the folk that lend the money, to come up with much more adventurous schemes so they can encourage people onto the
let me answer that point
ladder, I think.
about all those points. So the left wants secure borders, and I'll give you one quick example. More than 10 years ago, the Labour Party called for a points-based immigration system. Now the government have adopted that policy.
It's not really working, though, is it?
Jacqueline is
but you've just forgotten one point. Because when we had enlargement in 2004 and 10 countries joined the European Union, all the other countries in the European Union, like Germany, put a 7-year hold on anybody that came into their countries, then accessing immediately benefits, housing and all of those things. Tony Blair's government at that time didn't put the restriction in, and that was what started the ball rolling.
Okay. She's right.
You've got to give me a right to reply.
So we won't take any lectures there.
I haven't given any lectures, but I think Jacqueline's on a sticky wicket. First of all, she's going back to events of 10 years ago, then going back to events of 20 years ago. Lots of data showed that when the EU was enlarged, people came to work. The reason I say Jacqueline is very clever, because she knows in a country of 60 million people, sending 100, not a million, sending 100 people to Rwanda has literally no impact on housing at all. And Jacqueline, a bit of myth-making, but did challenge me to come up with one solution. So Labour had a policy 7, 8 years ago called Help to Build. So George Osborne had Help to Buy, which pumped up the housing market, forced up prices and allowed for a consumer-led boom, which supported them to win the 2015 general election. It did nothing to tackle supply or house building. At the same time, Labour called for Help to Build, which would be zero borrowing, repeat, zero borrowing, but incentives for banks to lend to individual companies backed by government guarantees. So it's a guarantee system, zero borrowing, build more houses.